So our original equilibrium happens at the intersection of our aggregate demand and our long run aggregate supply. We're missing one curve. We have a long run aggregate supply, and we also have a short run aggregate supply coming right through here. So this 500 million output, we call it our potential GDP. We can also label it E naught. And this is exactly like the chart in the book, the graph in the book. So if you need to relate to this later, you can. I'm keeping all the numbers the same and the labeling the same. So let's say that there's some situation that shifts aggregate demand to the right? Let's just, maybe there's an increase in, productivity, maybe there's an increase in consumption activity, maybe taxes get cut, maybe American-made products become more popular internationally, so our exports increase. Whatever the reason, doesn't much matter. But we're going to have a shift to the right of our aggregate demand curve. That should probably be in the right color. And now we find that we're at what's called E1. So we were at an E naught, our initial equilibrium, and now we're at the first new equilibrium that results from a shift in our aggregate demand from AD naught to AD1. And at this new equilibrium, we are at a higher output price. Now we're going to have a average price level. Sorry, at a higher output and price. Now we're going to have a higher average price level. This is going to be 125. And we're going to be at a higher GDP. This is going to be somewhere around $550 million. So at this new equilibrium, what's going on with the economy? So one of the assumptions that we make only for the short run aggregate supply curve is that all of the input prices are held fixed, right? So that might be why this is probably one of the more difficult models we're going to learn in this class, because it's not just because the dynamics of it are such. So at this higher demand, we're at higher price levels, right? We know that 125 is greater than 120, the price is increasing. Now again, one of the assumptions for the short run aggregate supply curve is talking about how all the input prices are fixed, right? So we're kind of going to half violate that assumption real quick. Because now in the medium term, when we realize this equilibrium at the higher prices, unemployment is going to be unreasonably low, right? We're going to have essentially negative cyclical unemployment. So instead of being from 3 to 5%, maybe it's at 2%. Unemployment's really low. What does that translate to? That translates to people going around and bidding for higher wages. What do higher wages translate to? Higher wages is one of our main input costs. So higher wages are going to result in shifts to the left of our aggregate supply curve. So we end up from equilibrium 1, where aggregate demand 1 intersects short run aggregate supply, but that's not sustainable. That rate of unemployment is too low. People are going to go and bid their wages up. The higher wages is going to shift the short run aggregate supply curve. So in the end, we're going to end up here at E3, And at E3, what do we find? We find that the price has increased to 130, but the actual output hasn't changed. We're right back where we started at $500 million of GDP output that year. So the neoclassical perspective says any kind of gains that you have from short-term aggregate demand stimulation are going to be offset by increases in prices later on. So some could say that we are seeing this happen, that we were close to a long-run aggregate supply equilibrium when COVID hit, and then the extra stimulus money shifted aggregate demand to a point where we were feeling some abnormal inflation that we haven't felt in 30 years here in the United States. That higher inflation then drove wages up, which then essentially eroded all of the real output gains that we thought we had clocked. We thought that we had realized them, but they turned out to be ephemeral because higher input prices shifted our supply, which decreased our GDP back to its original level, leaving us only with higher prices and with no change in our real GDP.